The first thing you learn in Tantalus V is that there's no such thing as a good day. There's only bad and worse, like choosing between the kind of grand that shouts at lesser beings. We've got more money than sense and we're damn proud of it. Statues of victorious Quolian warriors loomed in every corner, their expressions frozen in grim determination, or perhaps constipation, hard to tell with Quolians. High Chancellor Xylox, enthroned on a chair that could only be described as how many rare metals can we waste on this, surveyed the room with an air of someone who'd just sniffed something unpleasant. Gentle beings, Xylox's voice was slick, like oil on water. We gather today to discuss an unprecedented opportunity. The translator bots buzzed quietly, whispering alien tongues into the ears of the assembled counselors. Of course, Xylox knew most of them weren't listening. Why bother when you can just vote with the loudest spender? Humanity, he continued, managing to make the word sound like it was caught in his throat, a species we've long considered unthreatening, has presented us with a curious opportunity. Xylox paused for effect, though the only effect was a collective yawn from the back row. The High Chancellor leaned forward, a gesture that screamed, "I'm important and you should care." Their cultural practices, particularly their holidays, are ripe for incorporation into our own. There was a murmur of confusion or perhaps indigestion. It really didn't matter which. Counselor Zorbal, a being whose facial features resembled a pancake left out in the rain, squelched forward. "High Chancellor, if I may. What exactly do we gain from adopting the customs of a species that still struggles with basic plumbing?" Xylox gave a thin smile that suggested he was imagining Zorbal in a variety of painful scenarios. "Power, influence, unity. We can take their quaint traditions and make them, well, better." Zorbal's eyes glistened with a mix of skepticism and boredom. "You mean we take their holidays and sprinkle some Quolian glitter on them?" "Precisely," Xylox replied, his voice as smooth as a well-polished threat. "Imagine the Festival of Terran Light, the day of human harvest, a celebration of their endurance and our superiority." The room was silent for a moment. Then a counselor in the back, known for his love of fermented space algae, blurted out, "Do humans even have light festivals?" "Who cares?" Xylox snapped, his patience thinning faster than the hair on Zorbal's head. "We shall adapt their traditions, mold them into something useful." He stood, the fabric of his ceremonial robes cascading like an overdramatic waterfall. "We are not here to mimic them, but to surpass. To show that even their most cherished customs can be optimized under our rule." Another counselor, whose name was unpronounceable and face forgettable, raised a tentacle. "Won't the humans object to us appropriating their culture?" Xylox chuckled, a sound that was about as comforting as a knife sharpening. "Ah, but that's the beauty of it. They won't object because they won't know. Our intelligence reports suggest they are too busy celebrating these holidays to notice much else." The council chamber buzzed with a mix of amusement and disbelief. The Quolians were many things, powerful, egotistical, occasionally prone to hubris, but they weren't stupid. Well, most of them weren't. Zorbal squelched forward again, his curiosity piqued despite himself. "You really think we can pull this off?" Xylox's smile widened, revealing an alarming number of sharp teeth. "When have we ever failed?" There was a pause as everyone silently recalled the incident with the planet that had mysteriously exploded last cycle. But Xylox's confidence was infectious, or maybe that was just the quarantine alert. "We'll start with something simple," Xylox continued. "A holiday that aligns with our own values, something about sharing." "Do humans even share?" Zorbal asked, genuinely perplexed. "Only grudgingly," Xylox replied, his eyes twinkling with the kind of mischief that usually ended in a diplomatic incident. "But that doesn't matter. We will share for them." Satisfied that he'd thoroughly confused everyone, Xylox motioned for the meeting to adjourn. "Prepare to learn, adapt, and conquer," he declared, as if those words didn't describe their usual Tuesday. As the counselors filed out, Zorbal lingered, his mind churning like a derelict starship engine. "High Chancellor," he said hesitantly, Are you sure humanity is as harmless as they seem? Xylox gave him a look that could melt titanium. Harmless is such a flexible concept, counselor. They are preoccupied with their little planet and their little lives. What threat could they possibly pose? Right, Zorbal muttered, more to himself than anyone else. What indeed? The doors of the council chamber closed with a sonorous boom, leaving Zorbal alone with his thoughts and a vague sense of impending doom. If there was one thing he knew about humans, it was this. They had a tendency to surprise you, often in the worst possible ways. Back in his chambers, Xylox allowed himself a genuine smile. This plan was foolproof. He'd even consulted the Oracle of Glubnar, and it had only laughed at him twice, a good omen by any measure. He gazed out at the stars, vast and indifferent, yet so ripe for conquest. Let's see how long these humans remain oblivious, he mused, before they realize they are part of something much bigger. And with that, he turned back to his work, oblivious to the fact that, somewhere light years away, a group of humans was laughing at the very idea of someone trying to understand their holidays. After all, even they weren't sure why they did half the things they did. Ambassador Tovik was having a bad day. Not just the usual oops, I left my hovercar door open kind of bad. No, today was more in the how did I become the official Quolian ambassador to this mess ballpark. He sat in his cramped office, which was only slightly more comfortable than the inside of a garbage compactor, staring at the latest directive from High Chancellor Xylox. Implementing human holidays, Tovik muttered, rubbing his eyes. Because that's what intergalactic diplomacy is all about, party planning. His assistant, a small, wiry Quolian named Brix with a perpetual look of panic, shuffled in with a stack of datapads teetering precariously in his arms. Ambassador, the High Chancellor's orders, Brix said, as if the stack of datapads didn't scream it loud enough. Yes, Brix, I can see them, Tovik replied, taking the top pad. Did you also bring me a miracle to get through this without losing my mind? Sorry, fresh out of those, Brix said, his attempt at humor as strained as the elastic on his uniform. With a resigned sigh, Tovik flicked through the data. Holidays, traditions, bizarre human rituals. The humans seem to have a knack for turning every mundane event into a reason to eat too much and argue with family. He admired the commitment, if nothing else. Look at this, Tovik said, pointing to a particularly garish holiday involving pumpkins and inexplicably grotesque costumes. They call it Halloween. They dress up as things that scare them and then ask for candy. Sounds like a typical council meeting, Brix mused, cracking a rare smile. Except with sugar, Tovik corrected. Apparently the humans believe scaring themselves is fun. I can't decide if they're brave or just incredibly stupid. Why stop at one? Brix quipped. Tovik leaned back in his chair, which squeaked in protest, much like his soul. The task was simple enough. Integrate these holidays into Quolian society, make sure it looked seamless, and somehow avoid the whole project blowing up in their faces. Simple but not easy, especially when the rest of the council, full of skepticism and varying degrees of facial despair, didn't exactly share High Chancellor Xylox's enthusiasm for this cultural experiment. Zorbal, with his rain-soaked pancake visage, was the loudest critic, but he wasn't alone. Rumors, like a bad case of space fleas, were starting to spread. The common Quolian wasn't thrilled about adopting foreign customs, especially from a species they'd been laughing at for eons. Complaints had already begun trickling in, mostly the kind that started with, "What in the seven hells is a turkey?" and ended with, "I refuse to wear anything orange." Tovik knew he had his work cut out for him. Still, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of excitement in the challenge. After all, he was one of the few who found human culture fascinating, in a watching a space shuttle crash in slow motion sort of way. "All right, Brix," Tovik said, straightening up and adopting the veneer of confidence that all Quolian diplomats were supposed to have. "Let's get started. We need to pick a holiday that won't cause an interstellar incident. How about Valentine's Day?" Brix suggested, scrolling through the list. "Seems harmless enough. Tovik raised an eyebrow. Harmless. This is a day humans dedicate to love, which they express by buying overpriced flowers and heart-shaped chocolates. We might as well declare a day of financial ruin. Good point. What about Thanksgiving? Brix offered, undeterred. Ah, a holiday centered around gratitude and gluttony, perfect for a species that can't decide if they love or hate each other. It'll be like introducing a new government policy. They both snickered at the thought, but deep down, Tovik knew this was about more than just holidays. It was a test. A test of what humanity could offer the Quolians and how far the Quolians could stretch before snapping. As they worked late into the night, poring over endless reports and cultural analyses, Tovik couldn't shake the feeling that this mission was more significant than it seemed. The human holidays were just the tip of the asteroid. Beneath the surface were layers of potential chaos that could either revolutionize Quolian culture or send them spiraling into ridicule. Meanwhile, in the council chambers, skepticism was brewing. Zorbal gathered a small group of like-minded counselors, each more skeptical and pancake-faced than the last. Think about it, Zorbal said, gesturing dramatically. We're on the verge of making fools of ourselves on a galactic scale. Does anyone here honestly believe adopting human holidays will strengthen our empire? A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. They exchanged nods and grunts, the universal language of "we're all screwed." Xylox is playing a dangerous game, one counselor said, looking like he just swallowed a space lemon. What if the humans don't like us appropriating their culture? They're too busy fighting over their own territory and resources to care, Zorbal replied, though his tone suggested even he wasn't entirely convinced. But it's our people who concern me. They're restless. They want progress, not pandering to alien customs. But what can we do? Another counselor asked, wringing his tentacles anxiously. Xylox's plan is already in motion. Zorbal's eyes glinted with a mixture of determination and something darker. We prepare, we watch, and when the plan falters, and it will, we'll be ready to guide our people back to sanity. The counselors nodded, some more enthusiastically than others, and dispersed to spread their seeds of doubt. Zorbal remained, staring at the statues of Quolian warriors, wondering if their stoic expressions were hiding the same skepticism he felt. Back in his quarters, Tovik lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind a whirl of human customs and Quolian pragmatism. He couldn't quite shake the feeling that he was missing something, some crucial detail that would make or break this mission. But for now, he'd have to put his faith in his ability to adapt and the hope that humans wouldn't surprise them in ways they couldn't handle. The next morning, Tovik and Brix were back at it, armed with caffeine and a sense of impending doom. They'd settled on a plan. Start small, with a festival of gratitude similar to Thanksgiving. They'd call it Thanks for Being Better Than You Day, because subtlety had never been a Quolian trait. Tovik stood in front of a holographic screen displaying a vibrant autumn scene from Earth, leaves in colors that seemed to defy logic, humans in cozy sweaters, and tables groaning under the weight of food. It was picturesque, if a bit nauseating. So, how do we sell this? Tovik asked, turning to Brix. Bring in the food, the gratitude, and none of the arguments over who ruined the stuffing. Focus on the unity angle, Brix suggested. The High Chancellor loves unity, probably because he's the only one who can spell it. They worked through the logistics, planning events that would both honor the human tradition and adapt it for Quolian tastes. There would be feasting, of course, but also storytelling, games of skill, and perhaps a reenactment of a famous Quolian battle, because nothing says gratitude like simulated warfare. As they finalized the details, Tovik couldn't ignore the growing rumblings of discontent. Messages from disgruntled citizens were piling up in his inbox, each more creatively phrased than the last. He'd received everything from politely worded objections to threats involving various uncomfortable uses of the human holiday decorations. They're not happy, Brix commented, reading over Tovik's shoulder. Understatement of the century, Tovik replied, deleting another message suggesting he should reconsider his career choices. But he couldn't let that deter him. Sure, the plan was risky, possibly even reckless, but the potential rewards were too great to ignore. A successful integration of human customs could open new doors, strengthen alliances, and maybe even teach the Quolians a thing or two about thinking outside their meticulously ordered boxes. As the day of the first, "Thanks for being better than you" day, approached, Tovik found himself both excited and terrified. He'd poured every ounce of his diplomatic skill into this initiative, hoping it would be enough to bridge the gap between two very different worlds. Meanwhile, the council chamber was alive with tension. Zorbal and his cohorts had been busy, stoking the fires of resistance, ensuring that if this holiday integration faltered, they'd be there to pick up the pieces, and perhaps increase their power in the process. The morning of the festival dawned bright and clear, the kind of day that felt like it should be a turning point, one way or another. Tovik stood on a stage in the heart of the capital, surrounded by decorations that looked suspiciously like a cross between autumn leaves and Quolian military banners. "Welcome, everyone," he announced, his voice amplified to reach the throngs gathered before him. "Today we celebrate something new, a union of tradition and progress, a marriage of our strength with new ideas." The crowd was a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and the kind of boredom that usually accompanied mandatory events. Tovik pressed on, detailing the day's events, highlighting the feast, the games, and the storytelling, all designed to emphasize unity and gratitude, Quolian style. As he spoke, he couldn't help but feel the eyes of the council on him, judging, waiting. He had no illusions about their support. If things went south, they'd be the first to pull the rug out from under him. But for now, the holiday was underway. Tables were laden with traditional Quolian dishes alongside human-inspired fare. Tovik watched as citizens mingled, some with genuine interest, others with the kind of caution usually reserved for handling unstable explosives. As the day wore on, Tovik's nerves eased a little. The event was going smoothly, no riots, no diplomatic incidents, not even a food fight. Yet, it was almost enough to make him believe this crazy idea might just work. But deep down, he knew better than to relax completely. The whispers of discontent hadn't vanished, and the underlying tensions within the council remained. He'd succeeded in taking the first step, but the path ahead was riddled with obstacles, each more treacherous than the last. As the sun set on the inaugural "Thanks for being better than you" day, Tovik allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. The seeds of change had been planted, but whether they'd grow into a new era of unity or wither under the weight of skepticism was anyone's guess. He just hoped that, when the time came, he'd be ready to face whatever surprises humanity, and his own people, had in store. As he looked up at the stars, he couldn't help but wonder how long it would be before Quolian society was truly ready to embrace something as inherently chaotic as human traditions. For now, they'd taken a small step forward. What came next was a journey only time would tell. But one thing was certain. In a universe full of possibility and peril, the Quolians had just begun a new chapter, and Tovik was determined to see it through to the end, whatever that end might be. The day they'd been dreading had finally arrived. Halloween, the next chapter in the Quolian experiment with human holidays. Tovik stood in his office, his personal slice of bureaucratic hell, and stared at the garish decorations festooned across the city. Strings of plastic ghosts, cobwebs, and pumpkins with faces that looked like they'd been carved by a blindfolded Quolian were draped over every building. It was a sight that made Tovik's inner cynic cackle and cringe simultaneously. Bricks hovered nearby, looking more jittery than usual. "Do you think the citizens will get it?" he asked, clutching a datapad like it might suddenly sprout legs and run away. "Get it?" Tovik snorted. "Most of them can't even get along. But hey, maybe the prospect of free candy will miraculously unite them. Or start a riot," Bricks mumbled. Tovik smirked. "Wouldn't be the first time candy has caused a war." As the day unfolded, the streets filled with Quolians in a bizarre array of costumes. They'd mashed together human horror icons with their own cultural symbols, resulting in hybrids like Zombie Warrior and the Mummy of Quolian Roman 7, a nod to some obscure myth that only the most dedicated scholars could remember. The translator bots had done a decent job explaining trick or treat, but they'd fumbled the delivery. Most Quolians interpreted it as demand sugar or face wrath, which, admittedly, wasn't too far off. The chaos began almost immediately. Tovik watched from his office window, a cup of steaming liquid that only legally qualified as coffee in his hand. Below, a group of children, alien and human alike, rampaged from door to door, shouting demands and waving bags with greedy anticipation. Some Quolians, eager to embrace this new tradition, handed out sweets with bemused smiles. Others, less enthused, resorted to hurling whatever they had on hand, fruit, vegetables, and in one memorable instance, a small potted plant. "Well, that's one way to get your daily dose of vitamins," Tovik muttered as a flying apple smacked a child dressed as a vampire squarely on the head. Brix sidled up beside him. "Do you think we should do something?" Tovik swirled his drink, watching as a group of teenagers in mismatched costumes barreled down the street, pursued by an irate elder wielding a broom. "Nah, let them work it out. It's good for them to experience new cultures, right?" Even as he spoke, the tension in the air was palpable. Reports of minor scuffles and misunderstandings trickled in, mostly involving misinterpretations of costume intent or candy-hoarding accusations. It was all par for the course in what was shaping up to be a grand exercise in cultural confusion. Meanwhile, the council was getting antsy. Zorbal, with his usual flair for the dramatic, had called an emergency meeting to address the unfolding crisis. Tovik could imagine him now, gesticulating wildly, his features scrunched with concern, or was it indigestion? In the council chamber, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation of another disaster they could pin on someone else. Zorbal took the floor, his pancake face creased with righteous indignation. This debacle is exactly what I warned about. Our people are out there wearing ridiculous costumes, throwing things. It's madness." He paused, letting the murmurs of agreement echo through the chamber. "If we continue down this path, what next? Will we start celebrating human independence days? Will we adopt their inferior governance?" A chorus of discontented grunts and nods followed, some counselors looking as though they'd rather be anywhere else, preferably with a strong drink in hand. Back in his office, Tovik's comm buzzed incessantly, a litany of complaints and demands for explanations scrolling through at an alarming rate. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "You know, Brix, I thought it was bad when they suggested we import human dietary supplements. I never thought a holiday could be worse." Brix gave a half-hearted chuckle. "At least it's not Valentine's Day. Imagine trying to explain the concept of romantic love to the council." "That's not love, Brix," Tovik replied with a grimace. "That's masochism." The chaos reached its peak as night fell. The streets, now littered with candy wrappers and the occasional piece of fruit smashed underfoot, were illuminated by flickering jack-o'-lanterns, all part of the plan to create an eerie, festive atmosphere. It was working, though perhaps not in the way the humans intended. A loud crash sounded from below, followed by the shrill whine of a translator bot struggling to mediate a heated argument between two Quolians over the last piece of alien confectionery. Tovik sighed and finally dragged himself away from the window. "All right, Brix, let's go play peacekeeper." The streets were a spectacle, an impromptu festival of discontent. Tovik waded through the throng, offering apologies and explanations to anyone who would listen and receiving a barrage of opinions and criticisms in return. Brix trailed behind, scribbling notes and dodging the occasional projectile. High Chancellor Xylox's idea, was it? A particularly grumpy elder spat, his costume an unsettling blend of pirate and Quolian war chief. "This is what happens when you let humans influence our traditions," Tovik forced a smile. Think of it as cultural enrichment, the elder harumphed. I'd prefer enriched uranium. By the time they returned to the office, Tovik was exhausted, his patience worn thin by the sheer weight of complaints and the headache-inducing noise of the celebrations. He collapsed into his chair, contemplating the possibility of a vacation, somewhere quiet, preferably without any humans or holiday enthusiasts. Brix flopped into the chair opposite, looking equally drained. That was eventful, Tovik echoed, running a hand through his hair. I suppose you could call it that, or a cultural train wreck. The comms buzzed again, this time with a message from the High Chancellor himself. Tovik groaned as he read the terse missive, a summons to the council chamber where he was expected to account for the day's events. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, Tovik muttered, dragging himself to his feet. Come on, Brix, let's see how much more trouble we can get into. By the time they reached the chamber, the atmosphere was thick with recrimination. Zorbal wasted no time laying into Tovik, his voice dripping with disdain. Can you explain, Ambassador, why our streets resemble a battlefield? Tovik met Zorbal's gaze with cool detachment. Just another day in the office, Zorbal. You should try it sometime. Zorbal's eyes narrowed. This isn't a joke, Tovik. Our empire's dignity is at stake. Dignity? Tovik chuckled. Have you seen the costumes out there? The chamber erupted into a cacophony of voices, counselors clamoring to make their opinions heard. Tovik held up a hand, silencing them with a gesture of weary authority. Look, we knew there would be hiccups. It's a process, one that takes time, patience, and yes, the occasional disaster. But is it worth it? One counselor demanded. Think of it as an opportunity, Tovik replied, channeling every ounce of diplomacy he could muster. An opportunity to expand our cultural horizons and forge stronger ties with humanity. The room fell silent, the counselors exchanging skeptical glances. It was clear that not everyone was convinced, but at least they were listening. You have until the end of the month to show us some real progress, Zorbal declared, his tone leaving no room for argument. Otherwise, we'll have to reconsider this entire initiative. Tovik nodded, knowing full well the challenges ahead. Understood. As he and Brix left the chamber, Tovik couldn't help but reflect on the day's events. Sure, it had been a disaster in many ways, but it had also been a step toward something greater. At least that's what he told himself as they returned to the office, the prospect of another grueling day looming on the horizon. Do you think we'll ever get this right? Brix asked, a hint of doubt in his voice. Tovik shrugged. Who knows? But if nothing else, we're giving the Quolians a glimpse into the chaotic beauty of human culture. And if that doesn't kill us first, maybe it'll make us stronger. As they settled back into the rhythm of their work, Tovik couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something big. Whether it was revolution or ruin, only time would tell. But for now, he was content to navigate the uncharted waters of intergalactic diplomacy, one holiday at a time. Tovik was pretty sure that whoever had come up with the idea of adopting Thanksgiving in the Quolian Empire had to have been either insane or possessed by some malevolent spirit of chaos. He'd been tasked with organizing it, of course, because apparently the universe was having a laugh at his expense. Sitting in his cramped office, which was slightly more luxurious than a cell in a penal colony, he sipped from a cup of what the humans generously called coffee. Thanksgiving, he muttered, as if the word itself was an insult. A holiday celebrating gratitude and feasting. Sounds innocent enough, right? Until you remember we're Quolians. Brix looked up from a datapad, an eyebrow raised like a flag of surrender. I suppose the idea was to promote unity. You know, everyone giving thanks together, holding hands, singing songs and all that. Yeah, sure, Tovik replied, deadpan. Just until someone notices that the guy next to them has 3 times as much turkey on his plate. The city outside was being transformed once again, this time with decorations that looked like someone had thrown autumn at a wall and hoped for the best. There were leaves, turkeys, and cornucopias everywhere, like a harvest festival had thrown up all over the place. Humans had their own weird aesthetic sense. High Chancellor Xylox had issued another directive, one that Tovik had printed out just to have something to throw darts at when the stress got too much. The directive was clear. Thanksgiving was to be embraced wholly and without reservation. He sighed and glanced at Brix, who was busy shuffling through complaints and directives like a man trying to sort laundry in a hurricane. "How's the public reception been so far?" "Mixed," Brix said, which was diplomatic speak for disaster. "Some are trying to understand the concept of gratitude, but most are confused about what they're supposed to be thankful for exactly. And the feast. Well, let's just say that some citizens are getting a bit too enthusiastic about hoarding." "Imagine my surprise," Tovik said dryly. "A holiday meant to unify is instead exposing all the cracks, and cracks were indeed beginning to show. On the streets, the Quolians had taken to the idea of Thanksgiving with the same enthusiasm one might reserve for an impending dental appointment. Reports of brawls over who got the bigger slice of roasted Targon beast were coming in like clockwork, and the idea of public gratitude had quickly devolved into a contest of who could offer the most insincere thanks. A message pinged through Tovik's comm. It was from Zorbal, who was probably salivating at the chance to point fingers. "Come to the council chamber," the message read. "We need to discuss the results of the Thanksgiving trial." "Great," Tovik muttered. He stood up and smoothed out his uniform, though it did little to improve his mood. "Brix, keep an eye on things here. Holler if we need to call in the riot control." The chamber was the same as ever, opulent and intimidating, designed to remind everyone of the Quolian Empire's superiority, and more importantly, to make anyone standing in it feel small and insignificant. Zorbal was already there, looking like he was auditioning for the role of grumpy old man in a sitcom. "Ah, Tovik," Zorbal greeted, his voice dripping with condescension. "I trust you've been keeping an eye on the chaos outside." Tovik shrugged, taking his place among the other counselors. "You mean the cultural enrichment program?" Zorbal's pancake face folded into an expression that might have been disapproval or constipation. "Hard to tell, really. This Thanksgiving notion has complications." "Complications?" Tovik arched an eyebrow. "Is that what we're calling a riot over food portions now?" The chamber erupted into murmurs, the counselors expressing their agreement or disdain, depending on their preference for chaos or boredom. "Thanksgiving was supposed to unify our people," Zorbal declared, his voice rising above the din. "Instead, it's highlighted the vast inequalities within our empire." Tovik couldn't help but let out a laugh, a sharp, sardonic sound that echoed off the chamber walls. "Well, who'd have thought? A holiday based on abundance showing us who has too much and who has too little. Shocking." Zorbal glared at him, and Tovik met his gaze unflinchingly. "This isn't a joke, Tovik. The Empire's stability is at risk." "The Empire's stability was always at risk," Tovik retorted. "All we've done is give everyone a reason to pay attention to it." The counselors exchanged uneasy glances. No one liked change, especially not when it meant acknowledging that things weren't perfect. And in the Quolian Empire, where perfection was part of the branding, that was a bitter pill to swallow. "We need solutions," Zorbal insisted. "The populace is restless. Protests have started. People are demanding fairer distribution, not just of food, but of resources in general. And to think, all it took was a holiday about gratitude to spark a revolution," Tovik said with a wry smile. "Maybe next we can try Christmas and see if it leads to an armed coup." The chamber descended into chaos, counselors arguing, demands flying back and forth like quarrels from a crossbow. In the middle of it all, Tovik stood, arms crossed, waiting for the storm to pass. When things finally quieted down, he spoke up. "Look, the holidays are doing what they're supposed to do, bring issues into the light. But pretending that the problems aren't there won't solve anything." "What do you suggest then?" a counselor asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Tovik considered for a moment. "Maybe we should listen to what people are saying. Address the inequalities instead of just papering over them with imported traditions. Zorbal looked as though he might argue, but something in Tovik's stance stopped him. You have until the end of the month to come up with a plan. If you fail, the High Chancellor will put an end to this human holiday experiment. Understood, Tovik replied, though he knew it would be easier to explain quantum physics to a toddler than to solve the deep-rooted issues of the Empire in such a short time. As he left the chamber, he felt the weight of the task ahead pressing down on him like a starship's gravity. Thanksgiving had opened a can of intergalactic worms, and now it was up to him to find a solution, or at least to make it look like he was trying. Back in his office, Tovik found Brix staring at a data screen, the glow highlighting the worry lines etched into his face. "How'd it go?" Brix asked, though he probably already knew the answer. "About as well as you'd expect," Tovik replied, easing into his chair with a sigh. "The Council wants solutions, but they're not interested in addressing the actual issues." Brix nodded, tapping the screen to show the latest reports from around the city. "The protests are growing. People are demanding change." "Good for them," Tovik said, though he wasn't sure how much good it would actually do. "At least someone's listening." For a moment the two sat in silence, the weight of the situation settling around them like a fog. Then finally Tovik leaned forward, determination sharpening his features. "All right, Brix, let's devise a plan. Something that looks good on paper, at least." "You think it'll work?" Brix asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Tovik shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Probably not. But if we're going to go down, we might as well make it look like we tried." And so, the two of them set to work, navigating the treacherous waters of intergalactic politics with a mixture of cynicism and determination. The road ahead was long and fraught with challenges, but Tovik knew they'd face it head-on, one snarky comment at a time. Because if nothing else, they'd give the universe a hell of a show before the curtain fell. Tovik sat in his cramped office, contemplating whether throwing himself out of the nearest airlock would be a quicker alternative to dealing with another human holiday. Thanksgiving had been a disaster, and now Christmas loomed on the horizon like an incoming asteroid you just couldn't dodge. Christmas, with its emphasis on gift-giving, goodwill, and the kind of consumerism that made even the most hardened capitalist look like a saint. "Brix," Tovik called out to his ever-loyal assistant, who was buried under an avalanche of datapads. "How's the economic forecast looking?" Brix peeked out from behind the stack, resembling a gopher in a business suit. "Bleak, sir. Very bleak. The gift-giving aspect of Christmas is causing a strain the likes of which our economy hasn't seen since the great shortage of Spanglian lint. So, what you're saying is we're screwed," Tovik summarized, massaging his temples. "Wonderful. Counselor Zorbal is calling for a meeting," Brix added, a hint of dread in his voice. "He's not happy. Zorbal's never happy," Tovik replied. "He's got the demeanor of a wet sock in a rainstorm." The city outside, once again festooned with human-inspired decorations, looked like a madman's fever dream of winter wonderland. Snowflakes made from some cheap, glittery material hung from buildings, and holographic Santas dotted the landscape, their merry ho-ho-hos sounding more like sinister laughs as they echoed through the streets. Reports of civil unrest were pouring in faster than eggnog at a holiday party. People rioting over unfair distribution of gifts, families squabbling over who got the better presents, and of course, the inevitable fistfights in the toy aisles. It was like Black Friday had been stretched over an entire month. With a sigh that carried the weight of 1,000 headaches, Tovik made his way to the council chamber. The room, with its statues of victorious warriors, felt more oppressive than ever. Zorbal was already there, looking like he was about to burst a blood vessel. "Tovik," Zorbal greeted, his voice steeped in the kind of disappointment that parents reserve for children who've just announced they're dropping out of school to become a space mime. "This human experiment is tearing the fabric of our society apart." "Nice to see you too, Zorbal," Tovik replied, his sarcasm as dry as a Martian summer. Christmas, the gift that keeps on giving. Ulcers. Zorbal's face, ever the pancake, became even flatter as he glared. This frivolous celebration of material excess is unsustainable. Our economy cannot handle the strain and our people are restless. Tell me something I don't know, Tovik shot back, crossing his arms. I'm fully aware of the chaos. I live it every day. The counselors murmured amongst themselves, their whispers like a swarm of particularly irate bees. This wasn't just about Christmas or Thanksgiving anymore. The very fabric of the Quolian Empire was fraying, and it seemed no amount of imported goodwill could stitch it back together. We have to consider abandoning this project, Zorbal declared, his voice slicing through the din. We are on the brink of collapse. The people demand answers, and we have none to give. Tovik leaned back, considering his options. On one hand, letting this insanity continue might very well lead to the Empire imploding in on itself like a poorly made soufflé. On the other, abandoning the project might send a message to the galaxy that the Quolian Empire couldn't handle adopting a few colorful traditions. Look, the holiday was supposed to bring us together, but all it's done is highlight our issues, Tovik said, his tone softening, though his words remained sharp. Maybe it's time we address the real problems instead of putting a festive band-aid on them. The council chamber fell silent, the weight of the situation settling in like a lead blanket. For once, even Zorbal seemed at a loss for words, his pancake features frozen in an expression of begrudging acceptance. We can't simply abandon the project, Tovik continued, pressing his advantage. We need to find a way to make it work, to turn this mess into something that actually benefits us. And how exactly do you propose we do that? Zorbal asked, skepticism dripping from his every word. Tovik shrugged, a small, sardonic smile playing on his lips. I'll figure something out. I've got until the end of the month, after all. Returning to his office, Tovik found Brick still knee-deep in datapads, his expression one of utter despair. We need a miracle, Bricks, Tovik said, dropping into his chair. And I'm pretty sure those are in short supply. Maybe we just need to redefine what Christmas means for us, Bricks suggested, though his voice carried the weight of desperation. Tovik nodded, though he didn't feel particularly hopeful. Redefining Christmas for the Quolian Empire was akin to telling a star it needed to rethink its approach to burning. But what choice did they have? We've got to address the inequalities, Tovik said, more to himself than to Bricks. Distribute resources more fairly. Make sure everyone gets something. Bricks looked up, a spark of something akin to hope flickering in his eyes. You think that'll be enough? Probably not, Tovik admitted. But it's a start. And right now, a start is better than nothing. Together, they began drafting a plan that, with any luck, might just stave off the Empire's imminent collapse. Tovik knew it was a long shot, but long shots were often the only shots they had. As they worked, Tovik couldn't help but chuckle, a dark, weary sound that filled the room. You know, Bricks, I used to think the worst thing about the holidays was the music. Bricks snorted, the sound a brief respite from the tension. And now I think it's the part where they make you rethink everything you believe in, Tovik replied, a wry smile tugging at his lips. Merry Christmas, huh? The days passed in a blur of frantic activity, with Tovik and Bricks scrambling to put their plan into action. They met with economic advisors, community leaders, and anyone else who might have an idea worth listening to. The goal was simple: ensure that the holiday season didn't break the Empire in half. Yet, as Christmas drew closer, the situation only seemed to worsen. Reports of looting and civil unrest were commonplace, and the streets were filled with a palpable tension. The Empire was a powder keg, and the holidays were proving to be the match that could set it all ablaze. Tovik found himself spending more and more time at the council chamber, trying to convince the other counselors that their plan was the best shot they had. Zorbal remained skeptical, but even he couldn't deny the gravity of the situation. We're running out of time, Tovik, Zorbal said during one particularly heated debate. If we don't see results soon, the High Chancellor will pull the plug. Then we've got to make sure we succeed, Tovik replied, his voice carrying a steely determination. Failure isn't an option. The counselors weren't convinced, but they had little choice but to let Tovik try. The alternative was too grim to contemplate, and no one wanted to be the one responsible for the Empire's demise. Back in his office, Tovik and Brix worked around the clock, fueled by little more than hope and caffeine. The plan was ambitious and there were no guarantees it would work, but it was all they had. "Do you think we'll pull it off?" Brix asked one night as they pored over the latest reports. "Honestly, I have no idea," Tovik admitted, rubbing his eyes, "but we've come this far. We have to try." As Christmas Eve approached, the tension in the city was palpable. Tovik knew that the coming days would be crucial, and that they might very well determine the fate of the entire Quolian Empire. The evening before Christmas, Tovik stood at the window of his office looking out over the city. Snowflakes fell gently through the air, and for a moment everything seemed calm. "Do you think we can make it?" Brix asked, joining him at the window. Tovik shrugged, a small, wry smile on his lips. "If I've learned anything from this whole mess, it's that sometimes you have to believe in something bigger than yourself." "And what's that?" Brix inquired, curious. "That there's always a chance to make things right," Tovik replied, his gaze never leaving the city. "Even if it means doing the impossible." As they stood there watching the snow fall, Tovik knew that the coming days would be a test like no other. But for now, all he could do was hope and try. "Here's to Christmas, Brix," Tovik said, raising an imaginary glass. "May it be a miracle, or at the very least not a complete disaster." With that, they returned to their work, fueled by the slimmest sliver of hope. The Quolian Empire was on the brink, and it would take everything they had to pull it back from the edge. As the snow continued to fall, Tovik knew that this was their darkest hour. But it was also a chance to prove that even in the face of overwhelming odds, they could find a way to make things right. And maybe, just maybe, they'd find a way to celebrate Christmas in their own, uniquely Quolian way. Tovik's office was the site of a small-scale apocalypse, datapads strewn about like the aftermath of a particularly aggressive rebellion. Brix sat, shoulders slumped, tapping away with the air of a defeated warrior. Tovik himself had just come back from yet another grueling council meeting where everyone seemed to agree on only one thing: the Empire was in deep trouble. "I've got it," Tovik said, as he slammed a fresh cup of synth caf onto his cluttered desk, apparently having decided that caffeine was the only reliable ally in this miserable universe. "If it's anything other than I quit, I'm not interested," Brix muttered without looking up. "Not quite, but close," Tovik replied, his voice carrying a weariness that even a day-long nap wouldn't cure. "We need a new perspective. I'm calling in some human cultural experts." Brix looked up, raising an eyebrow that spoke volumes of skepticism. "Experts? From the same species that gave us this mess in the first place?" "Exactly," Tovik said, deadpan. "We need to understand what makes these holidays tick. Why humans bother with them at all, beyond the obvious desire to torment each other with terrible gifts and worse music." Brix sighed, nodding reluctantly. "All right, but if I have to hear one more rendition of Jingle Bells, I'm spacing myself." With that cheerful note, Tovik set about contacting the human emissaries, bundled together under a makeshift title he called Operation. Figure out why the hell we're doing this. Their arrival was as chaotic as one would expect, a cavalcade of colorful characters, each armed with their own idiotic insights on human holidays. "Thank you for coming," Tovik said, gesturing for the humans to take a seat, or at least what passed for a seat in the cramped quarters, an overturned storage crate that now served as a makeshift bench. "Why the long faces?" asked Dr. Marcy Levinson, a cultural anthropologist from Earth, whose perpetual cheerfulness was as irritating as it was infectious. "Holidays are supposed to be fun." "Fun?" Tovik echoed, incredulous. "I don't think looting and civil unrest count as fun unless you're defining it in a very liberal sense." Ah, growing pains, Marcy replied with a shrug. You should have seen Earth during the early years. We nearly blew ourselves up every time someone suggested a holiday might involve sharing. Tovik blinked, trying to process the idea that humans had once been as chaotic as the Quolian Empire was now. So how did you manage it? How did you not end up destroying yourselves? Adaptation, Marcy said simply. We learned to take the good with the bad to find balance. And then there's New Year, a time for reflection and renewal. It's about looking back and deciding what to let go of and what to hold on to. Brick snorted. Sounds like a therapist's sales pitch. Marcy chuckled. Maybe it is, but it works. We use New Year's as a chance to start fresh, to make resolutions. It's not about the presents or the parties. It's about deciding who you want to be. Tovik considered this, his brow furrowing. So, you're saying we could use this New Year concept to help stabilize the empire? In theory, yes, Marcy replied, with an optimism that was beginning to feel contagious. Instead of focusing on what you lack, focus on what you can become. Tovik leaned back, the wheels in his mind turning like ancient cogs. We need to change the narrative, shift the focus from materialism to something more meaningful. Exactly, Marcy said, giving him a nod of approval. New Year doesn't have to be about fireworks and parties. It can be about introspection and planning for a better future. Bricks, ever the cynic, piped up. And if that doesn't work, we can always just blame it on the humans, right? Naturally, Tovik said with a wink. But first, we have to try something radical. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Tovik and Bricks, armed with new insights from their human counterparts, began crafting a plan that was as audacious as it was desperate. The idea was simple: pivot from the chaos of Christmas to the promise of a new year, and in doing so, offer the Quolian Empire a lifeline. They called it the Festival of Renewal, and while it was less catchy than Christmas, it promised something more valuable than any gift: hope. The plan involved a massive public campaign, using every form of media at their disposal to spread the message. The Empire would focus on unity, on reflecting upon the past year, and on setting goals for the future. Citizens would be encouraged to participate in community activities aimed at strengthening social bonds, rather than tearing them apart over a limited edition galactic goo toy. As Tovik announced these changes in the council chamber, the room was filled with a mixture of skepticism and reluctant interest. Even Zorbal couldn't find it in himself to immediately dismiss the idea, though he looked like he was chewing on something unpleasant. It's ambitious, Zorbal conceded, his expression one of cautious intrigue. But can it work? It has to, Tovik replied, his voice firm. Because it's this, or watch everything we've built tear itself apart over who got the better present. The counselors exchanged glances, and slowly, the mood in the room shifted. Perhaps it was the thought of another Christmas gone wrong, or maybe it was the novelty of celebrating something that didn't involve consumer chaos. Whatever the case, the council was on board. Begrudgingly. With the council's approval, Tovik and Bricks set to work. The first step was to reframe the narrative, and for that they needed to get the word out. The Quolian Broadcasting Network was soon awash with messages of renewal and reflection, urging citizens to embrace the Festival of Renewal. You think they'll buy it? Bricks asked as they watched the first broadcast together in Tovik's office. They'd better, Tovik replied. I'm tired of pulling rabbits out of hats. Besides, a little bit of reflection might do us all some good. As the messages spread, something remarkable began to happen. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere in the city started to change. People were still grumbling, of course. They wouldn't be Quolians if they weren't. But the chaos seemed to ebb, replaced by a tentative sense of curiosity. The Festival of Renewal was scheduled to culminate in a massive gathering at the heart of the city, where citizens would share their resolutions on large public screens, creating a communal tapestry of hopes and dreams for the new year. It was a far cry from the material excess of Christmas, and Tovik couldn't help but feel a glimmer of pride as the day approached. The night of the festival, Tovik stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as citizens from all walks of life came together in shared purpose. For the first time in what felt like ages, the atmosphere was one of cautious optimism. "Looks like it's working," Brix said, coming to stand beside him. "People are actually talking to each other instead of fighting over overpriced junk." "Let's not celebrate just yet," Tovik replied, though he couldn't entirely suppress a smile. "We've still got a long way to go." As the crowd grew, a series of large screens flickered to life, displaying messages from Quolians across the empire. There were resolutions to help those in need, to build a more equitable society, to focus on what truly mattered. It was a testament to the power of hope and the promise of change. Tovik watched, feeling a sense of accomplishment that he hadn't known in some time. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always a glimmer of light to be found. "So what's your resolution?" Brix asked, a hint of teasing in his voice. "To find a way to get through the next year without losing my mind," Tovik replied with a chuckle. "And maybe, just maybe, to make the Quolian Empire a better place." Brix grinned, raising an imaginary glass. "To the festival of renewal, then. May it be the start of something new." And as the festival continued, Tovik allowed himself to hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they'd found a way to turn this holiday madness into something meaningful after all. As the first fireworks lit up the sky, he couldn't help but feel that the new year held the promise of better days, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of peace. As the night wore on and the festivities continued, Tovik knew that this wasn't the end of their struggle. But it was a beginning, a chance to redefine what it meant to be Quolian, and to forge a path forward that embraced the best of both human and Quolian traditions. For the first time in a long time, Tovik felt something he hadn't felt in ages. He felt hope. And as the city celebrated around him, he knew that this was only the beginning. "Here's to the new year, Brix," Tovik said, watching as the fireworks painted the sky with colors of renewal. "Let's make it count." Tovik stood at the front of the grand hall, a place that had seen more than its fair share of ridiculous ideas, many of them his own. Perched behind the podium, he surveyed the collection of counselors, dignitaries, and various other Quolians who had somehow managed to make their way into the chamber. It was a sea of grumpy, skeptical faces, exactly the audience he'd hoped for. "Welcome, everyone," Tovik began, trying to sound more enthusiastic than he felt. "Today marks the official start of our festival of renewal, and I know what you're thinking. Great, another chance for Tovik to mess things up. But bear with me." He paused, gauging the room's reaction. A few polite chuckles, mostly from those who still owed him favors. The rest sat in stony silence, likely contemplating whether they could get away with claiming the whole thing as a tax write-off. "Now, I'm sure you're all wondering why we decided to pivot from Christmas chaos to New Year's introspection," Tovik continued. "And the answer is simple. We were kind of running out of options. Also, there's less cleanup involved with self-reflection compared to 10 tons of gift wrap." That earned a more genuine laugh. Not much, but enough to make Tovik feel like he wasn't completely alone in this. Brix, standing off to the side with arms crossed in a manner that screamed, "I'm only here because I have to be," nodded approvingly. "Nice touch with the psychological warfare," he murmured when Tovik stepped back from the podium. "Thanks," Tovik replied. "I figured a little humor might butter them up before I hit them with the boring stuff." "Nicely done," Brix said, offering a rare smile. "And here I thought you were just winging it." "Winging it is my specialty," Tovik muttered. "Now, if the Quolian Broadcasting Network holds up, we might actually pull this off." Tovik's plan was to spread the concept of the Festival of Renewal far and wide. He'd even managed to rope in a few of the more charismatic counselors to record uplifting messages, though he suspected at least one of them was simply reading off a shopping list. As the recordings played, the crowd began to murmur among themselves. A few of the counselors exchanged glances, likely trying to decide whether this was the moment to start a coup or just a slow clap. Look at them, Brix said, his voice low with amusement. They're like a pack of Vorloxian bloodhounds circling a wounded space cow. Tovik snorted. Well, as long as they don't start gnawing on me, we'll be fine. Meanwhile, the broadcasts were doing their work. Messages of hope, renewal, and vague promises of a brighter future were being beamed out to every corner of the empire. It was either going to inspire the masses or inspire them to pelt his office with rotten Skrell eggs. As the crowd in the chamber began to break into smaller groups, discussing amongst themselves, Tovik felt a cautious optimism settling in. The plan was working. People were actually engaging with the concept of renewal rather than simply plotting to take his head off during the next council session. Small victories. Dr. Marcy Levinson, the human cultural anthropologist, sauntered over, her face plastered with that irritatingly infectious grin. Well, Tovik, looks like you've got them thinking. Not bad for an empire that thinks thinking is a dirty word. Tovik groaned, rolling his eyes. If I manage to get through this without being exiled, I'll consider it a win. Oh, come on, Marcy said, nudging him with her elbow. You're doing something good here. Besides, if they boot you out, you'll always have a place with us humans. He smirked at that. I appreciate the offer, but given your history with war and pestilence every other Tuesday, I think I'll pass. With the morning's events behind them, Tovik and Brix took a moment to breathe. They settled in Tovik's cramped office, datapads strewn about like confetti at a party no one was invited to. Think this festival of renewal thing will stick? Brix asked, fiddling with a particularly ancient datapad that seemed to be both a device and a museum exhibit. It better, Tovik said, taking a sip of his synth-caf. Otherwise, we're back to the drawing board. And I've already run out of crayons. Brix chuckled, thumbing through a stack of notes. Okay, so what's next on the agenda? More speeches. A new dance trend. Actually, yes. But don't worry, you won't have to shake anything you don't want to, Tovik said, suppressing a smile. We're rolling out community projects. Things that bring people together without the need for an angry mob. Like what? Brix asked, narrowing his eyes. Please tell me it doesn't involve more singing. No singing, Tovik promised. Mostly, we're talking community gardens, art collaborations, stuff like that. Let people make something new and maybe learn how not to hate each other in the process. Sounds ambitious, Brix said, skepticism etched into every word. But if it stops them from pulling each other's hair out, I'm in. As the day progressed, Tovik's plans began to unfold. Around the city, pockets of citizens gathered to take part in the new initiatives. Grandmothers who normally wouldn't be found dead outside of their knitting circles were suddenly orchestrating gardening clubs. Youths, who used to spend their time perfecting the art of sarcastic graffiti, were now creating murals that actually meant something. It was like someone had dropped a touch of humanity into the Quolian Empire, and for once, it wasn't met with immediate disdain. Overseeing these changes, Tovik couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and relief. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to look up. Think you could get used to this? Brix asked as they watched a group of Quolians work together to plant a tree, a symbol of renewal that had thankfully not been invented by the humans. Only if it lasts, Tovik replied, watching a pair of children race by in a game that didn't involve pelting each other with rocks. The festival continued, gaining momentum as more Quolians embraced the idea of renewal. Tovik's datapad buzzed incessantly with messages and updates from across the empire, most of them positive, an unusual phenomenon he wasn't entirely sure how to process. Even High Chancellor Xylox sent a message of endorsement. Well, more accurately, he sent an emoji of a thumbs up followed by several exclamation marks. It was a step up from his usual communication style, which involved threats and disdain. As the days turned into a week, the council began to take notice. They convened to discuss the impact of the Festival of Renewal, and for the first time in a long time, the mood was cautiously optimistic. Councillor Zorbal, who generally viewed optimism as a personal affront, begrudgingly admitted that the festival was having a positive effect. I suppose it's better than our usual method of waiting for everything to implode, he conceded with a grunt. High praise coming from you, Tovik quipped, earning a rare smirk from Zorbal. Don't let it go to your head, Zorbal replied. But maybe, just maybe, this human nonsense has some merit. The rest of the council echoed similar sentiments, though some remained wary, unsure of what this newfound unity might bring. Tovik couldn't blame them. After all, change was terrifying, especially when it involved admitting that humans might actually have something to offer besides questionable fashion choices. As the council adjourned, Tovik felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The Empire had taken its first steps toward healing, and while there was still a long way to go, the path forward was a little clearer. Looks like they're starting to come around, Marcy said, joining Tovik as he made his way out of the council chamber. How does it feel to be a hero? Tovik laughed, shaking his head. I'm no hero. I'm just the idiot who thought this might work. Well, your idiocy seems to be working, Marcy said, her smile as bright as ever. So what's next on your agenda? Survival, Tovik replied with a shrug. And maybe a vacation. I hear Earth has some lovely beaches, preferably ones without sentient seaweed. Sounds like a plan, Marcy agreed. But before you go soaking up the sun, how about joining us for a little celebration? The emissaries are throwing a party, and it wouldn't be the same without our favorite reluctant reformer. Tovik hesitated, the thought of festivities both appealing and exhausting. But then why not? They'd managed to pull off something extraordinary, and maybe it was worth celebrating. All right, I'm in, he said, feeling a rare sense of satisfaction. But if anyone starts singing, I'm out. Marcy laughed, leading the way as they headed toward the celebration. No promises, but I think you'll survive. As they walked, the city around them buzzed with energy, the air filled with laughter and the distant sound of fireworks. It was a new year, a new beginning, and for the first time in ages, Tovik felt a sense of belonging, a part of something greater than himself. Here's to new beginnings, Tovik said, raising an imaginary glass as they joined the party. And to surviving whatever madness comes next. To survival, Marcy echoed, clinking her imaginary glass against his. And as they celebrated, Tovik allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the future was looking a little brighter. The festival of renewal had brought them together, and with a bit of luck, it would keep them on the right path. Because if there was one thing Tovik had learned, it was that change was possible, even in a galaxy as grim and dark as theirs. Tovik shifted in his chair, adjusting the angle of the datapad before him. The thing had practically become an appendage, a necessary evil as he navigated the snake pit of intergalactic politics. As victorious as he felt for steering the Quolian Empire towards something resembling camaraderie, or at least a temporary ceasefire, he was fully aware of the precarious balancing act he was engaged in. The Grand Chamber buzzed with counselors and dignitaries, each more eager than the last to slap him on the back while whispering sharp criticisms in the same breath. Typical politics. But it was progress, and in the Quolian Empire, you took what you could get. Well, if it isn't the Empire's golden boy, quipped Counselor Zorbal, his face the same stony mask of displeasure it always was. He'd once told Tovik that his face was sculpted by the gods of disapproval, and it showed. Good to see you too, Zorbal, Tovik said, forcing a smile that felt like bending steel beams with his teeth. I was half expecting you'd be leading a coup by now. Who says I'm not? Zorbal replied, a ghost of a grin tugging at his lips. It's refreshing to see you haven't let this success inflate your ego. Much. Don't worry, I'll arrange to have it deflated at the next intergalactic summit, Tovik shot back. Nearby, High Chancellor Xylox stood with an air of distant approval, like a proud parent who didn't know whether to pat Tovik on the back or tell him to clean his room. The Chancellor's approval had always felt like an unpredictable weather pattern, useful, but liable to change without notice. I must say, Tovik, Xylox began, his voice carrying the weight of a man who believed he was the universe's gift to governance. You've managed to transform chaos into Slightly less chaos. High praise indeed, Chancellor, Tovik replied with a nod, hoping the sarcasm in his voice was subtle enough not to provoke an airlock-related incident. I'll take slightly less chaos over a full-blown riot any day. The chamber was filled with the hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses, the so-called dignitaries trying to outdo each other in displays of newfound optimism, or at least trying to appear optimistic, which was almost the same thing. Dr. Marcy Levinson, ever the beacon of maddening cheer, approached with that infectious grin plastered on her face. "Looks like you've managed to get them talking instead of plotting for once," she said, her voice like a bubbly waterfall of enthusiasm that Tovik found simultaneously endearing and exhausting. "Talk is cheap, but at least it's not armed," Tovik replied, tapping his datapad like it was a lucky charm. "So, what's the word from the human side of things?" "Any more holidays we should be wary of," Marcy laughed, a sound as bright as a supernova, though much less dangerous. "Well, there's Arbor Day, but I figure you already covered that with the tree planting." "Thank the stars for small mercies," Tovik said, pretending to wipe sweat off his brow. "Last thing we need is another festival involving more costumes and existential dread." As the evening wore on, the celebration continued with a surprising lack of chaos. Tovik took it as a good sign, though he kept one eye on the exits just in case. He had learned the hard way that complacency was a trap best left to the naive and the dead. Brix sidled up beside him, looking unusually relaxed. For a guy whose default state was one breakdown away from a psychotic episode, it was a welcome change. "So, what's it like being the savior of the Empire?" he asked, his tone dripping with the kind of sarcasm that could strip paint off a starship. "I dunno, Brix," Tovik said, feigning deep thought. "Feels a lot like being the scapegoat, but with a fancier hat." "At least it's a hat of your own making," Brix pointed out. "Beats the hell out of a noose." "True enough," Tovik conceded, scanning the room. It was still hard to believe that this crowd had once been a seething mass of animosity and petty grievances. Now they were a slightly less seething mass, which Tovik chalked up as a win. The success of the Festival of Renewal had brought with it a shift in attitude towards humanity, a realization that perhaps humans weren't just walking disasters looking for a planet to ruin. Sure, they were still disasters, but maybe less walking and more prone to sitting down with a nice cup of synthcaf to talk things over. As the night drew on, the counselors began to make their way out, their conversations soft but tinged with a newfound respect for Tovik's efforts. Even Zorbal, who had perfected the art of the dismissive grunt, managed a nod of approval. "Don't get too comfortable," Zorbal said as he passed. "Success is just failure waiting to happen." "Thanks for the pep talk," Tovik replied dryly. "I'll be sure to remember that during my next existential crisis." "Glad to help," Zorbal grunted, disappearing into the crowd with the grace of an asteroid field. As the chamber emptied, Tovik found himself standing alongside Marcy and Brix, surveying the aftermath of what had been a surprisingly successful evening. "Well, we survived," Marcy said, her eyes twinkling with that annoying optimism. "What do you think?" "New era for the Quolian Empire." "New era, same problems," Tovik said with a shrug. "But maybe now we can tackle them without tearing each other apart." "Sounds like progress to me," Brix said, clinking an imaginary glass with the others. Tovik allowed himself a moment of genuine satisfaction. Not bad for a day that had started with him wondering how to escape to a dimension where bureaucratic nonsense didn't exist. Maybe there was hope for this empire after all. The next morning, Tovik awoke to a barrage of messages on his datapad, most of them congratulating him on the success of the festival, some from counselors he hadn't even realized were capable of coherent thought. The rest were from High Chancellor Xylox, who had mastered the art of saying nothing in as many words as possible. His hovercar ride to the office was uneventful, the cityscape passing by in a blur of dazzling lights and buildings that seemed to compete with each other for the title of most unnecessarily tall. Stepping into his office, Tovik was greeted by the sight of datapads strewn across his desk like the aftermath of a particularly aggressive paper tornado. Brix was already there, somehow managing to look busy and completely relaxed at the same time. "Morning, sunshine," Brix said, not looking up from the datapad he was engrossed in. "Ready to save the universe again today?" "Let's just start with the Empire," Tovik replied, dropping into his chair. It creaked ominously, a reminder that even in the future office furniture was crap. The day passed in a haze of meetings, each one more tedious than the last. Tovik had always believed that meeting was just another word for waste of time, and today was proving him right. But as the hours dragged on, he noticed a change in the way people spoke to him.